You came to my room and said, Dad, I had this idea that you and I create a podcast. Your mom has been saying this to me for the longest time. He said, wouldn't it be great if you had spent enough time talking to Leon and Max, imparting some of the knowledge and the insights that you have so that they will embrace it and it become a gift to them. That was Mommy's prayer, And when you decided that we were to do this podcast, it's just, wow, this is fantastic. And as we do it, and I find this Friday sessions that you and I have, one of the best things we had in a very long time.
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon. This is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father-son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. Last week, we talked about problems to be solved versus polarities to be managed, i.e. discussing how do we resolve conflict in a healthy manner. And as we were discussing this, we talked quite a bit about polarities to be managed.
Yeah.
And as we were discussing this, we didn't have enough time to then go into this next section, but I thought it would be worth spending a bit of time today talking about then a polarity to be managed implies that there is probably not going to ever be a solution to it.
Yeah.
And therefore, how do we then have the endurance to manage those polarities? And I think we can talk about it from the viewpoint of managing conflict, but I think we can also speak broadly about endurance today. I really like this quote by Angela Duckworth. She says that enthusiasm is common, endurance is rare. How do we develop endurance? Maybe you can talk about endurance. You are no stranger to endurance, especially in your childhood, growing up in the jungles of Borneo, having to walk for up to a week to the nearest town. What was it that kept you going?
Well, Leon, the pursuit of impossible has always been the hallmark of human endeavor. Whether it's in breaking new, if you like, scientific discovery, achieving athletic feat, or pushing the boundaries on art, and whatever you're doing, there is a need for an endurance to come into play here, because without the endurance, you will give up very quickly. I think the word endurance comes together with the word resilience. The word endurance is about the capacity to keep going and having the stamina to go despite all the challenges and the difficulties. Where resilience is the ability to bounce back from the setbacks. So the two of them are the twin pillars of what is needed to succeed in human endeavor, to achieve the game of the impossible. So because
quite honestly, I never really saw the distinction.
Yeah, it is like that. So if I now put it back to you, Leon, I know that, was it last year that you went for your first marathon?
2 years ago.
2 years ago. Now, I want to dwell on that for now because there's a tremendous element of endurance in a marathon, because I have never done a marathon. So maybe I ask you the question, what did it take for you to go and run that marathon and have the endurance to complete it for the first time when you did it?
To be honest, I don't really consider myself someone who is naturally inclined towards things that require endurance. Historically, I've always preferred doing short bursts of things at a high level of intensity. In school, I usually took up contact sport or sprinting. I was a very good 100-meter, 200-meter sprinter. I never liked long-distance running. But I think I wanted to challenge myself during the pandemic. Obviously had the luxury of a bit more time at home.
Yeah.
So I said, me and my cousin Ryan decided, let's sign up for a marathon and let's just do it. Game of the impossible. None of us had run a marathon before, and we just said, let's just give it a go. For me, what helped was two things. I think first, having a program. So we signed up, we looked online, and we found a very structured 16-week program to follow.
All right.
So I think having a program, having a framework to follow, it gave us a sense of accountability because there was something to follow and there were not so many variables. So having a program helped. But one of the biggest things that I learned actually, and this was not, I didn't go into it with this knowledge, but it was something that I developed during the course of it, was I started to find out about a mode of training called the methadone method.
I see.
The methadone method is essentially low heart rate training. And so the ethos here is that when you run, don't look at the pace, but focus on trying to sustain a low heart rate throughout the run. So in my case, they call it zone 2, which in my case is anywhere between 130 beats per minute to a maximum of maybe 140 beats per minute, which is very low. And it meant for someone of a pretty low level of running skill at the time, in order for me to run at that heart rate, I would be practically walking throughout. So it became not just the endurance to actually run the race, but also an endurance to quell or keep the ego at bay. Because for me to run, let's say, a distance of 15 kilometers at a near walking pace is actually quite embarrassing when you have a lot of older uncles and aunties passing you on the road. So I realized for me, actually, a big part of it personally was dropping the ego and being comfortable with just knowing that it's not about the results, not about how well you do, but it's just about learning to enjoy the process. And so I think that was a big learning to focus on the process as opposed to the outcome. And if you're focused enough on the process, that sustains you over a longer period of time, and then the outcome will come after.
I see. So you mentioned earlier on when you began, you mentioned that it was very important for you to have a compelling why. Why are you doing this? That's very important because if you don't have a compelling why you're doing it, the slightest pain that is involved in the run, you will give up in the process. So you really have to have a reason why. And
the interesting here is actually my initial why actually was the wrong why, but it was good to get me started. The original why of doing this is just because I wanted to achieve the accomplishment of completing a marathon. But in retrospect, had that have been the only why, I think I might have been more likely to drop off at some point. What happened is that was the thing to get me started. But then as I started to do it, then I developed actually the more compelling why, reason, which was to teach myself how to not be so focused on an outcome, but to learn to appreciate the process. And that has had tremendous carryover into other areas of life.
And the second thing you mentioned was the training methods that you had to embrace. It's almost, in other words, this is what other people do to be able to succeed in a marathon. So you pick that method, the best practice methods. In business, it's called practice. If you practice and practice, you build a stamina. Without practice, you don't build a stamina. I'm pretty sure the training program that you are following allowed you to keep on practicing it. As you were doing that, the more you ran, the more you build a stamina. Because you don't simply run it until you collapse and you don't want to do it anymore. So you have to gradually build the stamina. I mean, these are very important components. And let me ask you a question about the mental and the physical health and emotional health, because that's very important in stamina. If you lose the mental health, the physical health, and the emotional health, you cannot have stamina to doing it. So what were the things that, in your mind, what were the things that helped you to really push to make sure you're mentally ready for emotionally ready to keep going? How many months did you practice?
It was 16 weeks.
16 weeks.
16 weeks of actual intentional training, knowing that I was going to prepare for a marathon. And I think prior to that, I had maybe only been running for just running casually for maybe 2 months.
How were you handling your mental and emotional aspect while you were doing that? Of course, the very painful physical part of it.
Yeah. For me, to be honest, the run itself was what was helping me to manage my mental and emotional. In fact, the reason why I started doing that is because in that period of lockdown, I was actually going through quite a difficult period. I think I was adjusting to life as being a new father. We were right in the smack of the pandemic, and so life felt very uncertain, and at the same time, just being constantly at home. Work as well was particularly stressful at the time, because now we were all adjusting to being, in a way, constantly on. I mean, the beauty of it was that we were at home, but also being at home removed that kind of separation between where does work start and where does the rest of your, your time with family begin. It just kind of seemed like you were always on call. And so I was coming to terms with that and maybe feeling a little locked up. And so I actually chose running originally as a bit of an escape. So the process alone actually was the thing that helped me to regulate. But maybe I can talk about it more generally in terms of managing mental and emotional. And actually that process, because it helped me realize that was very therapeutic and very helpful for me, because doing a run versus lifting weights, which is actually traditionally what I am a little bit more inclined towards and still am today. The thing with lifting weights is it's a more high intensity thing. So when I do that, I'm very just focused on the activity. With running, it allowed me the space to not really think too much about the activity.
Do you, when you run for a very long time, do you empty your brain? Completely, you don't think about it.
I don't think about. I start off thinking about it in the first maybe 5 kilometers. But the beauty is when you go beyond the 5 kilometers, once you've got your rhythm going,
I understand.
I found I was now able to spend the rest of the time in reflection, either sometimes praying or just thinking about things at a slightly deeper level, and that was what helped to regulate my mental health and emotional health as well. We in my church circle, with Abel, who is our associate vicar at HTBB, the church that I work for, we started an accountability group, and we talked about this thing of capstone habits. What are some of the habits that we figured have a huge impact on the rest of our day. And so the both of us, we realized that actually for us, it's our physical health, or rather it's exercise. So we started an accountability group to say that we will hold each other accountable for a habit of X number of days of exercise.
Very good.
Knowing that if we have our exercise in place, that sets us up to be more present as dads. It helps us to be better at our jobs, which was the case for both of us. So establishing, I think, to your question, finding joy in the process. And as a result of that, there's a lot of reflection as well as mental and emotional regulating that happens there. But then also establishing a structure or an environment, in our case, an accountability group to help to sustain that. What about for you? What are some practices that you maybe apply in your life, or perhaps even in your corporate life? I mean, you have done many difficult jobs. There have been a lot of things that you've been involved in, a lot of your previous work, where I sometimes would think, why did you continue? What kept you in the game?
Yeah, I think it's like this, Leon. When you talk about endurance and resilience, you see it from two perspectives. One, the individual. Two, the organization. How do individuals keep their own personal endurance and resilience at an individual level? And the other one is, how does an organization keep its endurance as an organization that means teams of many people and setback? So let me begin with the personal, which is the individual. As we started on sports earlier on, the first and most compelling thing is you must have a compelling why on a personal reason. If you don't put that in the beginning, in the face of difficulties, you will give up. So you have to have a really compelling reason why you're doing it. Because if it's not compelling, the more compelling the reason why you're doing it, the more likely that you have the resilience and endurance. So that's, and to your point, even if you start with a wrong why in the beginning, not the right why, you refine it to become more and more compelling. And that's very important. So I think that hook is key. The second thing is always this. To have endurance, you must have a long-term goal. So long-term is a very important idea so if you say in 10 years' time, this is what I actually want to achieve. But if you don't have a 10-year horizon in thinking it through, you will give up in the 1 year or 2 years or 3 years because you already have a long-term horizon. Then you break that down into, from a 10-year, what does it mean for you in 5 years? What does it mean for you in year 1? So when you start doing that, you have a trajectory of where you're heading. That's very important for endurance and stamina to long term, because you are no longer fixated on running a 100 meters a sprint. You now know you're going to run a very long distance, but that long distance require breaking down components here. So that they prevent you from giving up so soon. The third aspect, it's very important, is to have a growth mindset. And so people who are just purely transactional in what they do, I want to do this in order to achieve that, that's very transactional. But you have a growth mindset. You're always thinking about abundance. You're always thinking of growing your capability. Like you said, when you were running, it wasn't just wanting to complete the marathon, but you want to build your own capability in doing it. John Ruskin once said, the best reward for man's toil is not what he gets from it, but what he becomes of it. And that is actually a growth mindset. So when you embrace a growth mindset, you're now most likely going to be prepared to say, well, even if I fail in this transaction, I'm not going to give up, because your idea was a growth mindset, because you take the setback as how you recover from setback, which is the idea of resilience. Resilience is the ability to recover from a setback. So you embrace that. And the third aspect in what you intend to do is what we mentioned before. You must maintain a physical, a mental, as well as emotional well-being. Because if you don't have that, then you have a problem. So, for example, if you're working so hard in the office, if you don't have time to relax, to chill out, you're likely going to run yourself.
Can I ask,
empty.
how did you make time to do that with your very demanding jobs? I think all the jobs that you have taken on incredibly demanding, but the one that usually comes to mind, which I think was probably, at least in my eyes, as a kid just watching you work, I think our time at Sri Lanka was probably the one which felt the most all-consuming. It maybe was not the most kind of public one. I would say arguably your time in government or even MAS, a little bit more public, because it wasn't just Malaysia, but it was the rest of the world was also paying attention to what you're doing. Sri Lanka was a little bit more
difficult.
just held within a small country, but there were so many things. There were death threats, there were bomb threats that we were dealing with, very all-consuming. So how did you find time?
You see what I did? Let me turn back to the last point I said before. How did I maintain sanity mentally when handling that, at the same time, a physical well-being and emotional well-being? I actually had some friends there. So my management team became really good friends. To this day, all the guys who would work with me then, they are friends for life. I look at Dinuk, for example, Shoshana, who's in London today, and Radesh, who's also in India today. And these guys, we were really almost as if we're brothers in arms in doing that. I kind of felt that the more I talked to them, they were young. Many of them were just fresh graduates at the time. It was their first job. And they were looking up to me, and I really couldn't afford to fail them because they were looking up to me. And I didn't really know too much more about how to do it. But because I needed to do it, the reason why I needed to do it, and I look at everybody in my team, and if I had failed, there were more than 300 people that would be out of a job, plus their entire family. So the why for me was very important. Remember to the compelling why. So I knew that if I were to tell London headquarters that this business is unsalvageable, they would totally agree with me. We would have closed down the operation. And 350 staff with their entire family would be out of a job. And so the compelling why was there. And so really, to be honest with you, I was really unprepared for the job compared to any other role. So when I subsequently went to Shell Middle Distillates, Malaysia Airlines, and I had a lot of practice. As you said, practice makes perfect. As we ran, the more I ran, the more I built the stamina, the endurance. That was really my first attempt at a very challenging thing that we were doing. But I took a growth mindset at the time as well. I said, if I can succeed in doing this, this is very difficult. I'm going to build so much capability within my own leadership to be able to do this. And how did I get this growth mindset? I stumbled on this book by Tracy Goss. And a guy called Parson gave me the book 4 years prior to that assignment to Sri Lanka. He said to Idris, Idris, I'm going to give you this book. If you read this book and embrace the philosophy, your life will never be the same again.
So what was the key philosophy in that book?
The philosophy...
And also, what was the name of the book for those who don't know?
It's called The Last Word on Power, making the impossible possible. This is the idea of the game of the impossible. It was this book by Tracy Goss that really caused me to think about it, and it caused me to think about the growth mindset. That if I embrace this, there's no guarantee for success. But what is a guarantee? By following that path, I was going to develop and transform into a leader that is unrecognized than before I get. That's almost a guarantee. That's a growth mindset. It's just like the John Ruskin thing. So it was so compelling for me to do that. And so at that time when I was there for 3 years, we turned around the company, we made record profits. It was really fantastic. We dealt with all the problems we had. It was fantastic, Leon. And it was because of that I got promoted to big job in London. So the reasons why I got promoted into the big job in London, and head office job, was because of the work we did there. So it gave me tremendous confidence. And it was a period when I learned endurance. And I also learned resilience, because resilience about coming back from a setback. And there was so many setbacks that we went through. And really, when I look at this as well, at that time, we made small mistakes here and there. I was just reminded about Thomas Edison, the guy who invented the light bulbs. In this quote, he said, "I have not failed. I have just found 10,000 ways how it do not work." So every way that it didn't work, he had tried them 10,000 times. It was the 10,001 time that it worked. So that is a pure testament of endurance.
I've been reading, that reminds me, I've been reading this book. I've not finished it yet.
Yeah.
It's called Ego is the Enemy. It's by a guy called Ryan Holiday. He's very big in the podcast circuit right now. So, I mean, that's how I kind of came to hear about him. He has a very famous newsletter, and he's a big proponent or rather advocate for Stoicism. And so he wrote this book, Ego is the Enemy. There's a common thread here, because I consider myself someone who struggled a lot with having ego get in the way, hindering a lot of my pursuits. And so I tend to gravitate towards things that help me to put aside the ego. And so in this book here, it's a quote from a guy called John Wheeler. And he says that as the island of our knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance.
Wow.
As the
island of our ignorance grows.
As the island of our knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance.
I see. Wow.
And that's a really refreshing way to look at it.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I have found it very frustrating to think, why is it that when I feel like I have, I should be now in a place of having leveled up in whatever discipline, whether it's fitness or whether it's in my work, why is it that I keep coming back to having issues? Here comes another problem, you know, in family life as a dad as well. This constant bombardment of problems. And sometimes, I think in the past, where I have, if I reflect and think of times where I have maybe given up prematurely in things, I'd given up prematurely because I had not come to a point of acceptance that challenges are not really a problem. If anything, they're actually a bit of a blessing and a bit of a litmus test of growth.
Didn't embrace a growth mindset.
Exactly. But actually, this quote reminds you that when a new challenge comes, it's simply a sign that you have already overcome another challenge, and because you are now in a new frontier, if you like, you're in uncharted terrain. Naturally, there will be challenges.
Different sets of challenges.
Exactly. So I would now actually be very worried if I were to be challenge-free for a longer than expected period of time, because that's usually an indication of just being static. Let
me return back to the cooperation. Remember I told you about endurance from a personal standpoint, and I covered those 4 points. It's not too different from a corporation and organization. The first thing, they have to build a compelling vision. And that compelling vision, in my mind, has to be translated into a true north. That means a measure that is concrete and that is tangible. And if it is vague, it is not so compelling. You have to put it in a manner that people said, if you describe it so clearly and so vividly, people say, wow, I really like that. And so that for an organization, they have to have, I call it the promised land. They have to describe it in a manner that is so compelling, people want to go there. And that's number one. No? The second thing that they have to do in organizations, have a long-term goals. You have a long-term 10-year horizon, then you break it down to 5 years and 4 years, just the same way you do for the individual as well. And also you then ask the question, what does it mean for the organization in profitability terms? What does it mean for growth? What does it mean for employees? What does it mean for shareholders? So if you then say, over the 10-year period, this is what all the stakeholders will get out from it, obviously it becomes very compelling for them. So that's the second part. And the third one is invest in continuous improvement. Because I call it improvement, but now it's a slight twist from the original word we use of problem solving. Problem solving and continuous improvement is one the same thing. Because when you encounter a problem, it's also now saying, from this problem, what can I introduce in the organization to prevent the problem from coming again? So that's the continuous improvement. Whereas when you solve the problem, you just wait for the problem to come. But if you now said, I'm going to invest in continuous improvement, making sure that you put in preventive measures in place so that the problems don't come back. So that's key for you to do. But once you do that, obviously for people in the organization, you have to give training. All the competency training required. It's just like when you mentioned earlier on in your marathon, you have to have a training program that you put people through so that they have endurance to go through it over a period of time. You build capacity for people to know how to deal with circumstances, how to reinvent, how to solve problems, how to move this forward.
Yeah,
so it's not a simple thing.
Applying situational leadership to
Applying
myself
that.
in the low competence season, having not myself, but finding a sort of resource that would give me that directive kind of leadership, following a very prescriptive plan. And
Absolutely.
then over time, once you've figured out your rhythms, learning how to then adapt from that.
Let me give you one modern day example, just during our time. In 2020, when we had COVID, the whole world was on its feet on COVID. I had this idea, and I spoke to my team, Woody, who's in PEMANDU. I said to Woody on a Friday, Woody, I would like our team, led by you, to develop a global COVID index. The only index is approved by WHO that will rank 184 countries every day on their ability to deal with COVID. That means the number of deaths, the number of mortality, and the number of infections, number of recoveries, all those, the beds per patient, etc., all of that. And so we work with WHO. So at that time, when we were working with WHO, we had numerous conversations with them on Zoom call. Dr. Tedros himself, the big boss of WHO, was on the call with us because he kind of liked what we were doing. So he asked me, Idris, when you do this, that you realize, if we agreed to do this, you guys are going to handle 10,000 data points every day for as long as COVID is running. So I knew that, so I told Woody, when we do this, we have to do 10,000 data points every day for the whole time that COVID is going to. It's 4 years, we will do it for 4 years, every day. And
that on top of restructuring and right-sizing our organization.
Yeah. So the interesting thing was, quite apart from that, we agreed that we will develop the COVID index, which we did successfully do in 2.5 months. But that's like a sprint, Leon. But the endurance was, in fact, for 4 years, even to this day, we still have it running. Every day, since 2020, we've been running it every day. We know which country is number 1, which is number 2, based on all the parameters. And that's called endurance. Doing the ordinary thing extraordinarily well without fuss. That's the way in which I describe it to Woody and the team. And we've been doing that. I want to digress a little bit. The conversation we had with WHO was on the side. I asked them, WHO, what is happening with the scientific community in developing the vaccine? Wow, I was totally impressed. It was all hands on deck. Everybody was working flat out, day and night, despite all the setbacks. I think in living memory, there has never been a vaccine that is developed in a 2-year period that had passed all the tests, the scientific and medical tests, other than the one we have today for COVID. That tells you the element of endurance, resilience. All hands on deck, because if they didn't find a vaccine that could deal with this, the number of people that dies from COVID would have really mounted, because before the vaccine came in, there were more people that died from COVID than the First and the Second World War. And so it was this virus was a very, very big global war that we had to win. It was really interesting. To me, modern day example of endurance was the development of a vaccine in such a short period of time. There were hands on deck. There were various parties involved. All of them came with slightly different approaches to get it. Pfizer came with, all Moderna came with different one. The Chinese came with different versions of it. But they were all hands on deck. The interesting thing was they came out with it almost at the same time. It was really quite interesting, because I think there was a race going on inside there. While the endurance competition was going on, there was an element of pride amongst the scientists. I'm totally impressed with that work. If you ask me today, what's a modern day example of a scientific discovery in our short period of time in the last 10 years, I put my finger directly on the vaccines for COVID-19. So I'd say this, humans are at their best when their back's against the wall.
Yeah.
And this is exactly the classic example where human beings were really pressed against the wall. And when they were pressed, that's where human ingenuity comes in. Human ingenuity comes in, it must comes with heavy dose of endurance, because the number of mistakes, faults that they discovered along the way, whatever they tried did not work. They kept on doing it until they found the answers to do it. It's really incredible. I mean, I salute all the scientists and medical professionals involved in doing this. That to me is a classic example of human endeavor on the endurance.
Yeah, to close, I thought it'd be interesting, as you were sharing, especially talking about your personal examples of endurance. It's quite easy to turn to examples from your career, from work. Right now, when you are on sabbatical, oddly enough, because you playing this game of endurance, in doing the game of the impossible, having these very demanding jobs, as demanding as it is, I feel like that has also somewhat become your modus operandi. It has kind of become your normal. Yeah. I suppose on sabbatical, there's a little bit of endurance as well, surely, because, while for others it says, well, it sounds very nice to not be doing anything. If that's not how you normally operate, do you feel like it has taken a lot of endurance for you to take a back seat?
It is,
in
actually.
This time? And how have you been handling that?
Actually, it's a real struggle, because, for me to simply wanting to ask you guys, how is it going? Very simple question like that. Refraining from doing that is very, very difficult. Huh? And also sometimes, there are certain things I want to know, how is this going? And I really refrain from doing that. It is learning to shut out.
So what has helped you to do that? Because I must say you've been quite good at sticking to it.
Yeah, it has been. I have to occupy myself with some other thing. What I've been occupying, because I have, I call this the theory of vacuum. Let me digress a little. Okay. Theory of vacuum in my mind is, if you have a vacuum, air will rush to fill it. Whether it's good or bad air, it will be filled. That's the theory of vacuum. Okay. So if I'm idle, it will be filled with things to do. So the only way I can do it, I will fill my idle time with things that I really like. That's why I started rearing pheasants. I have a passion for doing that, going to the farm and doing the best I can in trying to raise some fish. And so I made so many mistakes, in doing it as well. And so because of that, I have to do research on how to hatch the eggs and how to do, how to control the temperature and the humidity and also all sorts of things. And that's kept me steady. And the other thing is this, I have so much time now to look at everything that's around in the world through the lenses of many people on world affairs. And so I read things on the internet, listen to YouTube, all sorts of conflicting views. I had to make sense of it by really pausing and ask which is fact and which is fiction, and why do I believe these are facts, these are the truth, these are false, and what are the evidence that I have. So I had now been beginning to build my own repertoire of what I call Idris Jala's teachable point of view on world affairs. So I have a little note that I put down many things that are happening in the world, my own teachable point of view on all of these world affairs, and these are the evidence that I have for each one of them based on what I've read and what I've heard on YouTube and all the debates. So I've read so many debates on religions as well. And so on Islam, on Christianity, on Buddhism, and I started to do all that. And also started to look at philosophy as well. And I started to delve into sports, and particularly on soccer, really understanding Pep Guardiola's style of playing football and the tiki-taka, and why Spain, the current manager of Spain, suddenly want to abandon tiki-taka for the European, the Euro Cup. Yeah. And really I started to look at, because I'm a big fan of Chelsea Football Club, so I really studied and listened to Enzo Maresco, our new manager, and I studied exactly his interviews. I must have seen his interviews more than 5 times, really understanding exactly why he plays it like that. Quite similar to Pep Guardiola, but not exactly. I went back and read Pep's book called Pep Confidential. And so I started to read that as well. Then I realized that the way in which he was playing was heavily influenced by the Dutch way of playing football they call total football. And that was how it evolved into that. So what you see today in the way Barcelona had been playing and how Pep had took it on from there, it was originally starting from the Dutch, from total football. But of course, they modified it. And so Pep Guardiola, as he moved into Bayern Munich, he also modified the tactics a little bit. So when he came to Man City, he changed it. One obvious thing that I realize now, he has to change because depending on the kind of players that you have. You don't have the exact kind of players that will be able to execute exactly your all methods, so you have to modify. So back to the point was, I begin to fill my time with so many exciting things like that. And so I find it very, very good for me to be able to do that. And I didn't have time to do that before.
And it seems that these are not, I don't know, maybe a little bit like my running. Maybe the initial why, perhaps, not sure if it's true, but maybe could have started as merely doing these things to distract yourself from
in the beginning.
feeling of wanting to do work. But then actually in doing so, it sounds to me like you have now realized that actually
it's good.
Completely honoring your sabbatical to do things like this that you wouldn't otherwise have time to do is arguably actually setting you up to then be able to return actually a little bit more effective, having spent time reflecting on certain things, having gained a lot more kind of lateral knowledge in other areas as well. And I return to, I talked about this Maffetone method for running, but perhaps didn't elaborate enough on actually what's the reason for doing this method. The idea here is you train at a low heart rate in order to build your baseline fitness. So if you were to simply focus on top-end speed every time, what will happen is that you probably learn to run faster. With each run, you will naturally probably increase that speed. But the idea of this low heart rate training is that you keep training at a low heart rate so that as you rack up the miles running really, really slow, you increase speed not just based on top-end speed, but you increase the speed while maintaining this low heart rate. And the idea here means that come the day that you are supposed to do the race, you have put in the hours essentially doing what you are doing, taking a back seat to allow for your body to properly prepare itself to then finally go and output. So this idea again of taking a step back in order to then take 2 steps forward, and our bodies are very much designed to do that biologically. And so just listening to you, it sounds like that's very much what you're doing in this sabbatical.
Leon, the other thing is this, totally unplanned for my sabbatical. One morning you came to my room and said, Dad, I had this idea that you and I create a podcast. And that was totally unplanned. And I found, your mom has been saying this to me for the longest time. He said, wouldn't it be great if you had spent enough time talking to Leon and Max, imparting some of the knowledge and the insights that you have so that they will embrace it and it become a gift to them. That was Mommy's prayer, And when you decided that we were going to do this podcast, it's just, wow, this is fantastic. And as we do it, and I find this Friday sessions that you and I have, one of the best things we had in a very long time, because we talk so many things, we had our own quiet time to do it. Nowadays as well, there's so many demands that requested for you and I to go and do speaking engagement duo. Today, we just had a session with another organization and a PMI, and then previously we were in Johor together, and 3 sessions in Johor, and then we also have one in Night Frank as well. So we had one in Jakarta with the Indonesian government.
More to come as well.
More to come.
Yeah, so exactly. This, if it wasn't for the marathon training, that would not have set me up to really think about how to run this thing. How to run this thing sustainably. And you see, the reason why I have talked about this before, but the reason why I did not step forward to finally launch this, because this has been an idea for 3 over years, is because I was so focused on the outcome, on wanting us to achieve certain things, to achieve a certain number of subscribers and views. But then I completely changed the model to think, well, what is it that would allow us to do this thing in a way that would be enjoyable and meaningful, even if nobody listened to this podcast? When I thought of its initial shape and form, it was just going to be me interviewing friends and different people. And of course, we are going to move towards bringing in guests as well. But I got stuck there because I was only thinking about what is the potential reach going to be. And if I'm not able to secure anyone, if nobody watches, it might be a little bit boring. And that's when I looked, I said, what can I learn from the running? I said, well, the running was me learning how to enjoy the process. So I switched my thinking and thought, in the 3rd year of ruminating on this idea, what will make me enjoy the process? And I just thought, why not turn it into a conversation with my dad? Because if nobody watches, at least I'm also learning something from it. A lot of people say, thank you so much for doing these episodes. It's such a great service to all of us. But I tell them sometimes, to be perfectly honest with you, sometimes it also feels kind of it's maybe a little bit selfish on my end too, because I learn so much just from doing this, both learning from you, but I also learned so much just in the process of doing it. And all of the...
You don't have a cameraman, there's no idea.
Yeah,
you
we do it all
ourselves.
But we do have a gentleman called Caleb. Shout out to Caleb, who mixes our audio for us. So we record, and then I send him our audio file. He cleans it up for us to make it sound good. But otherwise, it's still very much a one-man show. Obviously, we would like to, in time, involve other people in the process. But it's amazing that just by doing this kind of going slow, just focusing on enjoying the process, not really thinking too much about what the outcomes would be. Of course, having a little bit of strategy with how we roll out content, how we pick titles. But amazingly, just by showing up regularly, keeping to a weekly upload schedule. Today we're very late in recording the episode. I'll have to edit it tonight in order for it to go live. But showing up consistently over time, you'll begin to reap the rewards. And right now, we're starting to see the fruit in having speaking engagements. So it's a real joy to do this, And I think that would be a good way to end today's podcast.
Maybe it's good to quote John Ruskin, because a lot of the things we're talking about endurance. When you think about endurance, this growth mindset is very important. I mean, he says this. Again, I want to repeat. The best reward for a man's toil is not what he gets from it, what he becomes of it. So in doing the endurance, you become transformed into a much better version of yourself. And that's, I think, the experience that we both have in even doing this podcast in our work and environment. So all of you guys listening, we are telling you endurance is one aspect of human hallmark that will make you achieve the game of the impossible. But if you do that, remember always the growth mindset. This growth mindset is that the best reward for your toil is not what you get from it, what you become of it.
And if you've made it this far in the video, you've already demonstrated great endurance and a desire to achieve the impossible just by making it to the end of this episode. So for all of our listeners and viewers, we just want to say thank you for supporting this channel. And we ask that if you are not already subscribed either on our YouTube or to our Spotify, do subscribe. It really helps us to know, and it really helps us to keep going. And as we mentioned earlier, we do want to start to bring in guests. We actually have a few guests already in the pipeline, and you'll find out more about those soon. But thank you so much for supporting us. Do subscribe, and you can follow our short form content on Instagram at The Game of Impossible or TikTok at The Game of Impossible. Thank you all for listening, for watching, and we'll see you next week.